Scientists have identified a safe operating space for humankind. The bad news is that we are doing badly when it comes to climate change, biodiversity, freshwater consumption, chemical and plastic pollution, nutrient pollution, land use change and forests. Humans are not only causing climate crisis, we are also causing a biodiversity crisis, a forest crisis, a soils crisis, an ocean crisis. We are creating this everything crisis, and we are leaving the safe operating space for humanity. We desperately need an economy within these planetary boundaries. We need to understand what are the solutions that really move the needle. Our thesis is that by being able to identify those founders that really provide the solutions to the huge challenges that we are facing, for instance, the solution for green steel or decarbonizing cement, those will be the winners of tomorrow, and those will generate the outstanding returns that we promise to our LPs. The science team and the investment team always work in parallel. Whenever the one side thinks the market is not promising, the cap table is disastrous, or on the science side there's just no significant positive impact, then the other side just drops the pen and that's it. Our aim is to really turn that black box of impact assessments into a glass box and make it fully transparent. All of our impact assessments are published on our website to be challenged.
Thanks for coming on the show today. Your company, Planet A, is headquartered in Berlin, but you're living in Cape Town, but you grew up in Germany. So we need to make some sense out of all this. First, tell me, where did you grow up and what was your early life like?
So I grew up in a small town close to Hanover, Germany. As the eldest sibling of four, my passion has always been with the environment. When I was in middle school, I saved the whales and I did big school campaigns. And then I spent my summer holidays saving sea turtles in the Mediterranean Sea. Maybe it comes out of that responsibility of being the eldest. I always had that feeling of taking responsibility for something larger than my own little life. And that is why I then decided to study political science, because I was so interested in understanding how do we bring about positive change and how can we improve environmental protection. And so I studied political science in Heidelberg and at the University of Massachusetts, which gave me a super interesting kind of cross-Atlantic perspective on international policy regimes. And then I did my master in Berlin at the Free University in Berlin.
Was any of this distilled in you by your parents? I mean, it's not necessarily normal for the oldest child to always take on the world's responsibilities.
I don't think it was something that my parents were particularly passionate about. They were both doctors, and we had a lot of interesting political discussions around the lunch table. That is true. But I also felt sometimes a bit lonely in my family, being the eco-warrior and bringing the milk home every single day in the glass bottle, so to avoid the plastic. And I was also heavily educating my smaller siblings that did not enjoy that too much, I guess. So it was rather something that came out of me and maybe the friends I gathered around me.
You went to Heidelberg University, you studied political science and history. What history was it that you were studying and why?
I studied modern history as well as medieval history. And to my utmost horror, I discovered that for the medieval history, I had to know the whole Latin. So within 1 year of intense learning, I digested the big Latin, and I was really dreaming in Latin. My focus was more on modern politics and how that changes society. So that interaction of recent history and forward-looking, what are the lessons that we take out of history, and what do they teach us going forward? That connection, that point where history meets political science was always the most interesting to me.
You did a couple of years of study at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. How did that opportunity to study in the U.S. come about?
I knew that after my bachelor, I wanted to go somewhere. The United States have always been a very fascinating place, and all of our culture was very dominated by the US. So, and also when you look at political science, many of the very influential thinkers come from prestigious universities in the United States. So when the state of Baden-Württemberg offered me a scholarship to go to one of the universities in Massachusetts, I didn't need to think twice. I took the opportunity and spent a year there.
And how was your U.S. experience?
I attended graduate classes and it was really high level, super intellectual people who wanted to become professors afterwards. And it was very stimulating, challenging. And also I was confronted with new trains of thoughts. Like I had never encountered gender studies in Heidelberg. I wasn't as exposed to modern critical theory. So for me, I really absorbed all these new inspirational ideas, and it was a very fascinating year. And I had the chance to, after my studies, do internships in New York, which was also like mind-blowing for a young person, obviously. And I was working at United Nations associated organizations. And so I had the chance to take a peek into the big politics at the United Nations, which for me as a young political scientist was obviously amazing.
Your thesis for your master's degree was titled The Effectiveness of International Environmental Regimes. So I guess you're not kidding that you've had a keen interest in environmental science and policy since the beginning.
There was a chance after my studies where I did a small summer visiting associate thing with the Boston Consulting Group, where they offered me a permanent job. And I had that super nerve-wracking decision to make, whether to go for obviously quite profitable and very stimulating career path with BCG, or rather follow my true passion with the environment after my studies. And I chose the latter. So I opted for working at an environmental research institute in Berlin. I wouldn't say there was a right or wrong decision, but I felt very strongly always that I wanted to be part of generating knowledge on the big questions that challenge society, which is energy transition, climate transformation, and also provide some insights into what we can do as a society about it.
You're speaking of your time at the Ecological Institute in Berlin.
Yeah, and the German Advisory Council on Global Change for the German government, the WBGU. It's an independent scientific advisory council of different distinct science working together, coming up with tremendous policy advice for the German government. How to incentivize the uptake of renewable energies, what to do with the agricultural policy, and how to incorporate environmental objectives into it. I did that for 5 years, and I worked with some of the smartest people in German science in that field. With Professor Schellenhuber, for instance, he was an advisor to Chancellor Merkel, and we generated brilliant knowledge, I find, looking back at the big volumes of books that we wrote. But I think we were brilliant in generating that knowledge, but we were not good at translating that knowledge into something that was digestible for those who have to implement stuff. So I find that in Germany, we often lack the transfer mechanisms to transfer the knowledge into policy action. And after a few years, I felt it was a bit cheap to always give the good advice, but never having to do it myself. So I opted to change sides and become part of the ministry itself.
You said it very quick, as a German would say. This was the WBGU is the acronym. I wouldn't even begin to try to pronounce that in German. How do you say the government agency?
Wissenschaftlicher Beirat der Bundesregierung Globale Umweltveränderungen.
All right, so I'm vindicated in not trying to say that. While you were there, you also, it seems in parallel, co-founded something called 3+X. What was that and why, and how did that come about?
Those were the late 90s, early 2000s, and there was a lot of enthusiasm about the big Rio conventions. And we sometimes forget that in 92, the whole world came together and not only came up with the climate convention, but also came up with the Millennium Development Goals and the desertification convention, which in my view is a super important political agreement on the future of soils, basically. There was a big interest in sustainability, but no one really knew how do you translate that into whatever you do. And so I, as a young professional in Berlin, felt I was challenged by so many questions. What does it mean? What does it mean for my work? And how can I push for more sustainability in my world? That I felt others must feel the same. So I was looking for people that feel very passionate about sustainability, coming from all venues of life. And then I co-founded 3+X because we were 3 founders, and the X's were hopefully those people that were dealing with the same struggles. And we quickly gathered a lot of young people around the table, inviting them for workshops, sharing learning, inviting influential speakers to our meetings in order to strengthen those people, us. And then everybody felt they had a little push in the back and could go back to their insurance company, their banking retailer, their whatever they did. And so it was a very beautiful moment. But after a few years' time, I felt that I either had to do it professionally and dedicated my whole time towards that, or I would hand it over. And I opted for the latter. And as it is sometimes with handing over, it's difficult to hand something over that you founded and it didn't work out. So it's not existent anymore, but it was quite influential at that time. And I'm still in touch with many of the 3+X members from that time. And it's super interesting to see that everybody is still so passionate about these bigger notions, and they do amazing things, be it at the Allianz, be it at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, be it as founders in startups.
And then in 2006, you went to work for another government agency. The acronym is BMZ, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but I think English translation is roughly a government agency in the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development.
The Ministry for Economic Cooperation. And it's in charge of the international cooperation that Germany has with other regions and states. And I was very interested in working on things like sustainable finance, for instance. So how do you transform these huge tanks like the World Development Bank or the regional development banks? How do you transfer them to less fossil-heavy institutions? So I was working a number of years on these bigger issues, and I loved working as a government official. I'm not one of those that bashes the big bureaucracy and the slow pace, because I think there's a reason for that as well. And what I loved about the work was that it was always very systemic. I was never the one that was motivated by improving that one orphanage. I was always much more motivated by the question, how can we change the whole health system, but so that all orphanages in that country can improve? And as Germany, because you have some resources and a good reputation in your back, you have a voice at the table. So I felt that it was good work that I was doing there. I also knew that I didn't want to do that work solely from the desks of an industrialized nation. I wanted to do the work in one of our partner countries and really understand how they see the challenge and what their possible answers are. Because there's a lot of talking about seeing eye to eye and developing ownership in the partner countries. But in the end, I felt, is it really that we as the West want to learn from Tanzania? What do we want to learn? Is there a single thing where we think, oh, that is really something that we are doing so badly, and Tanzania is excelling in that? And I didn't have that impression. It was more like, okay, we know how success looks like, and we can show you. And I wondered how that was different if I worked in the partnering country. And so I took the chance in 2013 to move to Tanzania, and I had 3 little kids. My youngest was only 6 months old. And my husband, he's an entrepreneur by heart, and he said, I will follow you wherever you go, as long as it is at the ocean, because he loves the ocean and he's a passionate kite surfer. And he took care of the kids, and I did my work at the embassy then.
So during your time there in Tanzania, you did some cool things. One point, you were in charge of the Serengeti and the Selous game reserves for the German government and working from Dar es Salaam. And you financed the first elephant census. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it was a fascinating time. When I came to Eastern Africa in 2013, there were a lot of rumors around poaching. And to me, poaching was something that we had left behind in the 80s. So I was utterly surprised to see that it was still going on and really causing so much damage, but no one really knew. And I still remember talking to the local World Bank director at that time and he said, listen, I hear all the rumors, but I can't react on it as long as I don't have any data. And so Germany, who has felt very passionate about the Serengeti and these other unique biodiversity-rich ecosystems since the times of Professor Jimmick, was ready to finance and launch the first elephant census in the Selous that had been done for a long, long time. And the results were shocking. We found that 2/3 of the elephants had been killed within 5 years. So the Selous had gone down from 43,000 elephants down to 13,000 elephants. It was really a cemetery. When you flew over the Selous, you saw carcasses everywhere. And that was a super important signal. And it brought the whole donor community together. So there were more than, I think, 30 or 40 donors trying to support Tanzania in various sectors. So what we wanted to try is not duplicate efforts. And we set up a donor group. It was a very political time. And we tried to support Tanzania as best as we could. And I think we did make some progress. The larger problem was that there was such a high demand in mainly China and also Vietnam, and that these poachers were, when it came to technology, just very advanced. And it was easy to beat the rangers that sometimes did not even have walkie-talkies. And I think education is also key, because a lot of Chinese people take it as a sign of wealth. They have this tradition and history of beautiful carvings of ivory tusks and put them into their living rooms. And interestingly enough, I had the chance to meet Jane Goodall, one of my heroes, the chimpanzee researcher, and she shared that some Chinese think that elephants shed their tusks like deer. And so for her, it's also a lot about education.
Your time came to an end in Tanzania. It seems that you moved down to Cape Town, took your children and your husband in a car. What prompted the move? And tell me about your journey down to Cape Town, which is where you're at today.
I loved my work there, and I would have loved to stay. But after 4 years, the ministry usually calls you back to headquarters. And then we decided, no, we don't want to come. And we always wanted to spend some time in Cape Town because it's such a beautiful, energetic city. And the children had gotten to know it during a Christmas holiday, and we all felt we wanted to be there for a while. So we just took our car and drove the 5,000 kilometers first to Western Africa and then down to South Africa, and just tried to make it happen. There was nothing waiting for us there. There was no job, no family, no friends, no school. We took an Airbnb, we applied for a school, and my husband found a first job, and I took a leave of absence from the ministry, and it all worked out beautifully. And after 10 years, we are still here.
That leave of absence turned into the founding of Planetary Ventures, and I think you founded it in 2020, so you did that just in the nick of time for the COVID pandemic to hit. You were a co-founder. You had some co-founders that joined you in doing that, and tell me how that came about.
That leave of absence from the ministry really gave me the headspace to think something new. And one of my dear friends, Fridtjof Detzner, he's also co-founding partner at Planet A. Whenever he came down to South Africa, we were like nerding around what it takes to scale innovative green technologies faster. That is how the idea for Planet A came about. And then we Fridtjof pulled together 4 other founders. So in the end, we became 6 co-founding partners that brought Planet A into the world. And we were all not VC guys looking for greener pastures. It was more the question, okay, what does it take to address green technologies and scale it faster? And how do we use that small window of opportunity that we still have? And we all felt that venture capital has a super important role to play, but it hasn't played it so far. It hasn't really shown that tremendous strength in anything that is relevant for society at large, addressing social and environmental challenges. So we set out to create a very new kind of venture fund that puts science into the heart of it and addresses those sustainability solutions that really move the needle. And we co-founded just before COVID. So I co-founded a venture fund without knowing 4 of the other 5 co-founding partners at all. We met 1.5 years purely remotely, and only after 1.5 years I got the chance to meet them in person. And it was astounding how small the surprise was. Like, we felt so comfortable with each other, and we had built up so much trust over these thousands of Zoom calls that it felt like we had known each other forever.
Your other co-founding colleagues, was their motivation identical? None of them came from finance background and they were all passionate about the science, or how would you describe it?
Everybody of us has a very unique superpower. So while mine is the science side, the others bring in more of the entrepreneurial or investment side. So, for instance, Fridtjof, he was a successful founder. He had built a hugely successful software company. Tobias, for instance, he worked at Hanse Ventures and had invested and built companies early stage. And Nick also was an early stage investor, very much knowledgeable about the whole deep tech and crypto space. And while my passion had always been the environment, each of my co-founding partners had this aha moment, sometimes really a moment, sometimes more a progression, where they felt, now I want to dedicate my life to something that is really relevant. And so we all came together for Planet A.
Your other co-founders include Tobias Sekel, is that right? Nick Delaforge, Friedrich Detzner, Christian Schad, and Christophe Gras. I don't know how you say his surname. That's quite interesting career move, because until this point in your life, your entire background seemed to be in policy. You have a lot of other things going on with some external advisory roles. Maybe you could mention 1 or 2 of these organizations and just say a few words about who they are and then why you allocate some of your very precious time to supporting them.
I think the role of venture capital managers has changed tremendously when it comes to the climate tech, green tech space, because I do a lot of policy advocacy, to be honest. And traditionally, VC has more work behind the curtains, has not been exposed to policy that much. But it's clear that we need to shape the markets that we can invest in. So I deal a lot with, for instance, policymakers in Brussels via my engagement with the Clean Tech for Europe initiative, introducing this is what the young green steel maker needs from you moving forward. And we managed to set up a Friends of Clean Tech group at the European Parliament, which is awesome. I think that's why I dedicate a lot of time there. And then another example I can take is the EXIST program of the German government. It's a program that is meant to support scientists and researchers out of universities and research labs like the Fraunhofer to found companies out of their research, to really bring the innovation onto the street and scale it. And I find that is super important. We are very good with innovation in Europe. I was surprised to see that we still hold almost 50% of all patents issued worldwide, but we are not that good in turning that into commercially viable businesses. And that's why I want to support that initiative.
Let's get into Planet A Ventures, and maybe we can start if you can give a high-level introduction, an overview of Planet A Ventures, maybe starting with the mission, what sectors you focus on and assets under management and number of employees. For someone listening who never heard of Planet A Ventures, and to get a snapshot in their head before we drill down on some more of the details.
Planet A is a green tech venture capital fund that invests in European startups that have a positive, significant impact on the environment while building scalable global businesses. And we invest in early stage companies. So in the VC jargon, that would be pre-seed, seed, Series A. So more than an ideal, but not the commercial plant yet. Because we understand the challenges are quite broad, so the answers also need to be quite broad. So we invest in manufacturing, we invest in energy, we invest in food, in software solutions, in ag tech. So a broad range of 6 categories that we invest in. But then we are very specific on what we are looking for. We look for innovation in 4 key categories, which is climate mitigation, biodiversity protection, resource savings, and reduction of waste. The fund is based in Berlin, and we, as its first-time team, first-time fund, obviously was a very interesting journey up till now. What helped us raise our first fund was our very strong network to successful founders. And when we told them what we wanted to do with Planet A, they said, this needs to happen, and I want to be part of it. And then they sent a check. Founders have a very distinct risk profile, and it's amazing. If they believe in something, they go for it. So that first seed money allowed us to do the first investments and showcase what we could get into, showcase what our signature was, and then slowly, family offices gained trust. And then in the end, we were able to attract the big institutional investors, which take 12 months sometimes for a due diligence, but then also bring in the bigger ticket sizes and also bring in a lot of knowledge on processes, ESG. So they really make your fund more robust. And now we have this beautiful kind of broad range LP base and managed to raise 160 million euros with our first fund last year.
So it's one fund until now, is that right?
Yes.
Yep. And about how many employees do you count that you have?
It's a bit bigger than usual early stage VC because we opted for that science team. So now we are 18 people and there's an office in Berlin, but we are remote first. So you can work wherever you want as long as you're in the same time zone, more or less. With that, we attract the best talent in Europe.
And the fund structure, is that open or closed-ended?
It's closed.
What's notable in your first fund, you have support from some big name investors like BMW and KfW Capital, which is one of the world's largest development banks, and REWE, one of the largest German retailers, and the Vækstfonden, the Danish state's investment fund, as well as a couple of high-profile serial entrepreneurs like Rolf Schromgens of Trivago, Maximilian Backhaus of HelloFresh, and Ruben Ritter from Zalando. How did you get that type of exposure and the confidence of those big corporate players and those high-profile, well-known entrepreneurs to invest in your first ever fund?
A mixture of having a good network from the start. So with some of my partners, they are really well grounded especially in the DACH entrepreneurial ecosystem, but also the wider European ecosystem. And I think key was the credibility that we brought, because before us, there was no venture fund that brought that kind of scientific depth and authenticity with it. And a lot of people are still and were impressed by that approach and said, yes, we get it. If you want to invest in climate tech, especially in hardware, you not only need to understand the tech itself, which is challenging enough if you look at nuclear fusion, alternative proteins, etc., but you want to understand the impact of that onto the wider environment. Does it really make a difference? And so people understood that our approach was unique and they believed in our mission and they thought this needs to happen.
Explain to me Planet A's theory of change and the problem or problems that you're trying to solve.
So scientists have identified a safe operating space for humankind and defined quantitative boundaries. They are called planetary boundaries. And the bad news is that we as humanity have transgressed already 6 of these 9. So we are doing badly when it comes to climate change, when it comes to biodiversity, freshwater consumption, chemical and plastic pollution, nutrient pollution, land use change in forests. So humans, us, are not only causing a climate crisis. I think this is super important, but we are also causing a biodiversity crisis, a forest crisis, a soils crisis, an ocean crisis. And in fact, we are creating this everything crisis, and we are leaving the safe operating space for humanity. And when you listen to some of the climate scientists, especially last year, they lack the vocabulary to express their concern. They have been shouting on the top of their lungs for 30 years now, and they really don't know what to do anymore. And so we desperately need an economy within these planetary boundaries. And I am deeply convinced that we don't have the time to just throw money into the air and see what sticks. We need to understand what are the solutions that really move the needle. And that is why we anchored impact into every step of our investment process. And our theory of change is very clearly on, we want to shape an economy within the planetary boundaries, and we want to make impact investment the new normal. We don't want to invest money into something that is not contributing to an economy within the planetary boundaries. We just cannot afford that. And how do we do that? We support startups with capital, obviously, but also with network, with impact, with collaboration. And we thus support these founders in scaling and maximizing their impact potential faster. And we also, very importantly, we demonstrate that impact not only goes hand in hand with financial returns, but for us, it's quite the opposite. Our thesis is that by being able to identify those founders that really provide the solutions to the huge challenges that we are facing, for instance, the solution for green steel or decarbonizing cement, like the big, hard-to-abate questions that we are facing, those will be the winners of tomorrow, and those will generate the outstanding returns that we promise to our LPs.
You value impact as the highest metric, but it is an investment fund. So how do you think about the relationship between impact and financial returns?
The one does not exist in our context without the other. So I would not say impact first, financial returns first, but we always look at it parallel. This is also how we work. Like the science team and the investment team always work in parallel. And whenever the one side thinks, guys, there's, I don't know, the market is not promising, the cap table is disastrous, or on the science side, look, there's just no significant positive impact, then the other side just drops the pen and that's it. So we look at it very holistically from both perspectives.
Either side can veto an investment, either the investment side or financial side or the scientific side.
Exactly. I think that's quite unique, that the science really has a veto at the investment committee meeting.
Speak about Planet A's investment process, and if you could just walk me through the end-to-end process that Planet A goes through, and when you select an investment, and maybe starting at the beginning, how do you identify your investment universe?
So obviously there are a few easy criteria. The startup has to be in Europe. It has to be commercial. It has to have first sight the potential for positive impact, and it has to be scalable. And then in the beginning, we were investing more opportunistically, I'd say. But now over the last 3 years, we have developed a lot of theses on what subsectors are interesting to us and why. And so now we are a bit more thesis driven in our investments. And as I said, the investment team and the science team always works in parallel. So when it comes to the screening, so the very first moment that you have a company on the table, you would just do a quick check on the deck, the market size, could it work, the founding team, the business model, and take an educated guess, look at their own green claims, and look at it from could then work. And then if you build confidence, we take it to something that we call the deep dive. So you would spend a bit more time. You, from the science perspective, would look into some scientific literature, understand the magnitude of the potential impact. From the investment side, you would look at the usual parameter, team, market, defensibility. And then we do an investment committee meeting where the team meets the founders and then discusses. And we do a voting process in the end to establish whether there's enough support for that deal. And someone at least has to really burn for that opportunity. And then during the due diligence, we calculate a full-fledged life cycle assessment. And also we do the usual checks, obviously, legal checks, ESG checks, checks on the tech maturity, like what every VC fund does as well. A lot of what we do is plain vanilla. But on top, we put that green lens, that science lens. And then when it comes to the closing, we have done 24 investments so far, from synthetic fuels for the aviation industry to green methanol for the shipping industry to alternative proteins, precision fermentation, bio-based materials, software solutions for the more resilient supply chains. We integrate sustainability clauses into our shareholder agreements. So our founders commit to establishing a climate policy, a diversity and inclusion policy, and an ESG policy. And obviously, we don't leave them alone with that, but we support them in doing that. And we provide them with the life cycle assessment, which gives them the opportunity to understand which levers do they have to maximize their impact. And then during the holding period, we put a lot of effort, time, and dedication into enabling our portfolio founders. And that ranges from looking for talent, making corporate intros, that is about improving their impact, that is about improving their brand and communication. So there's a whole range of services that we provide.
How are your investments structured? Are you mostly looking for controlling interest?
We aim for minority share, 10% roughly. Our usual ticket sizes are $500,000 to $4 million. And we have enough dry powder for follow-on rounds. And we like to lead, but we don't have to lead.
That's straightforward. Your exit strategy.
The IPO market has dried out a bit over the last 2 years, but there are promising signs now that it is living up again. So we see a lot of interest, and we have done 9 successful up rounds with our existing portfolio. So it's a bit too early to say, but it's performing quite strong, and there hasn't been a single write-off yet.
How much of your AUM is deployed?
We have deployed around a third. We dedicated like half of it for initial investments, and then roughly half, and then the second half is for the follow-on rounds.
You look after the science impact measurement aspect, and it seems to be core to your investment strategy. Explain what science impact measurement means. Tell me how Planet A measures the impact of its investments. I need to make you aware that you're speaking with a finance guy who only made it out of his high school physics classes because my girlfriend did my homework. So you have to explain this in a way so that even I can understand what you're doing.
When I came into the industry, the VC industry, I was surprised to find that even in the year 2020, we were not in a position to really understand the impact of an investment on the environment. And every fund that tried to had their own proprietary little assessment method, little scorecards, and methods that might work internally, but that does not allow us to compare impact across funds. And so we set out to change that. And what we did is we installed an in-house science team. I think we might still be the only ones doing that. So that's me and then my lovely 2 senior lifecycle assessment analyst colleagues. And what we do is we assess the environmental impact of an innovation, be it a product or service. And unlike ESG funds that like to understand the negative impacts and the financial risks, we only want to understand the positive potential of an innovation. We look at the ESG side as well, but the core is really understanding the positive potential of an innovation. And we do that by calculating life cycle assessments. Now, life cycle assessments are nothing new. They have been around for decades. But what is new is to put them into the investment process. And what it means is that you look at the life cycle of a product or service from the extraction of the raw materials to the transport, to the use case, to the very end of life of that product or service. And then you take it even one step further. This is what we do, at least with the consequential life cycle assessment. We want to understand what is the systemic impact of that product. So what is the effect of that product when we bring it to the market? And that is why we look into, okay, what products are being replaced by this innovation? What feedstocks are being replaced? And get a very holistic understanding of the impact of that innovation into the system. And it allows you to not only calculate the carbon footprint, but also the energy consumption, the water resource, the land use, etc. And it gives you a very precise scientific and quantitative understanding of impact. The question will be, where do we take the data from? So the data comes from the companies themselves as far as they have them, because they are very early. So sometimes they have very little data on their processes and products. And the rest of the data we get from globally available databases like EcoInvent or Gabi that contain the results of millions of scientific studies. And if you purchase your plastic granulate from Croatia, it has a different footprint than from Albania. So it's super granular. And you take these data and you work with assumptions, obviously, how the, for instance, electricity grid in Europe evolves. And then you can understand how much better that innovation really is compared to what's on the market right now.
Everyone wants to have a positive impact, right? I don't think anyone will argue with that. But what is the criteria for an impact to be sufficient? How do you determine that, yes, this is sufficient impact or this is not sufficient impact?
So we have not set any thresholds. We feel that we are not only looking at climate, we are looking at biodiversity, energy, a lot of other parameters that are absolutely impossible to set an absolute threshold because it's highly localized. And so what we are looking for is the disruptive systemic impact. And I might want to give you an example of one of our portfolio companies to illustrate more what we are looking for. So let's take Traceless. Traceless is a Hamburg-based, bio-based materials startup founded by two amazing female founders. And the problem there is that almost 80% of all plastics ever produced are still in landfills or in our oceans, and they cause serious marine and environmental pollution. And so far, close to 0% of the plastics currently produced are degradable in a live environment. And so Traceless developed an innovative technology that for the first time allows to use agricultural byproducts to create a material that can replace plastic. And it has the same qualities as plastic, but it is fully compostable in the environment. So now the science team, we were super excited about it. And our LCA found the following, which then convinced us that we want to do that investment, and we did. So first, they do not compete with food production because they take agricultural residues. So thereby, they're preventing a land use change. That's the one parameter. Then, in contrast to conventional bioplastics, they do not need any harmful additives, solvents, or chemicals. Then thirdly, it requires up to 80% less energy to process compared to conventional plastics. And then lastly, the LCA showed that the overall net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is up to 76% lower than the virgin fossil plastics that we use every day. Clearly, that is significant positive, and that is why we invested.
Giving some examples of the types of impact that you have concluded, have produced, or will produce over the life cycle, just so people listening can get an idea of the end answer of some of these analyses that you've done.
I think our aim is to really turn that black box of impact assessments into a glass box and make it fully transferable. That's why we also publish everything that we learn. So all of our impact assessments are published on our website to be challenged. We found that in those companies that we partner with, there was always a tremendous improvement vis-a-vis the existing technologies in terms of greenhouse gas emission savings, because climate mitigation obviously is a key factor for our investments. But then also reducing the pressures on land, so saving biodiversity, then saving energy in turn translates into needing less fuels, fossil fuels. Another parameter would also be water. I mean, how much water can we save with a new solution? And also abiotic resources like critical minerals. It's a very holistic picture that we can paint quantifiably with these life cycle assessments. And most of these investments that we did, for instance, when we look at greenhouse gas emission savings, they are able to save 60 to 90% in emissions compared to what's on the market right now.
Do you have minimum criteria, like you won't consider something that doesn't reduce emissions by at least 60%? How do you evaluate that the number you're looking at is good and investable, or no, we're going to veto that?
It's never the impact assessment alone. Obviously, you might find a technology that has a 90% improvement, but then you find, okay, no, the founding team will never pull it off. So then you would rather obviously invest into something that's 80% better, where you think the founding team is stellar. So it's always a mix. We look at it from a market business perspective, as all the other funds, and those parameters have to be perfect. But then again, we also look at it from a science perspective, and we want to be convinced that this is part of the solution and not part of the greenwashing.
Do you ever see companies where perhaps it's close to being investable, but it doesn't quite tip it to get a green light? And do you work with them to try to make it work? I'm just trying to get at the relationship between science and impact. Yeah.
We sometimes even get founders that say, listen, I understand we are not partnering, but could we still work on our impact? Because a lot of founders struggle to grasp their impact. And it is difficult, but it's also super important. And in my experience, a lot of founders overestimate their impact. They sometimes come with claims where you think, whoa, but these assumptions are just not credible. But hardly any investor has the means to really go into that and challenge that. But we do. And mission-driven founders value that a lot. And I think that is also what we learned over the years, that the science-driven approach does not only allow us to take very precise investment decisions, but it also attracts mission-driven founders that value that credibility and that value add, because everybody is green at the moment, and it's very hard to cut through that noise. And for them to have the quantitative evidence for their green claims, it's super important. And they use the LCAs a lot with customers and with investors. It's a competitive edge that we bring to the table.
I believe you're the only early stage VC that has a completely in-house science team that conducts what you've referred to as the life cycle assessment analysis. And I had a look at some of the reports you produce on that, and they seem to be extremely thorough. Although, remember what I told you about my knowledge of science. Do you only conduct this analysis after you've decided to allocate capital, or is it something you do it on all of your potential companies in your pipeline?
We do these life cycle assessments as part of our due diligence prior to investment. So I know that other funds provide the LCAs as a service, as part of their enabling efforts, but for us, it's part of the investment process. And if the outcome of the LCA is not positive enough, we will not invest. This means that the whole perspective changes, and science get a totally different role in the process than if you just deliver a nice paper afterwards. It really has a fundamental role to play in our whole process.
What is the process of conducting the analysis? You source data from the company, but some part of it's proprietary analysis that you've developed in-house?
There was some learning involved. In the beginning, we thought, let's do a live tracker of impact. Let's do charts on our website where we can showcase every single week how the impact of our portfolio companies develop. But that disregarded the aspect that these companies are super early. For some of them, it will take 2 or 3 years until they will generate impact at all. Think about energy storage, think around green methanol. It's super early. And others might not want to publish their weekly production numbers because they need some protection. And so we scrap that, and we are not sharing that. But what we are sharing is how much better an innovation is. So when you look at the traceless LCA, for instance, you will see exactly why the bio-based material that they produce is so much better than the plastic that you can usually purchase. And then on the basis of these LCAs, we set impact KPI that we set up in consultation with the founders and that we share with our investors on an annual basis. So we track these impact KPIs annually, and the impact KPIs need to be approved by the main investors. So that's a check and balances governance scheme. We cannot set them ourselves, but we table them and they need to approve them. So in order for them to be ambitious enough, but also realistic enough, because obviously there needs to be a chance that we can achieve them. And then we tied 50% of our carried interest to achieving these impact objectives. And these are bottom-up calculations. So we always look at impact from two sides. First is the science side. How much better is that innovation? And then the second is the business side. How fast can that innovation scale? Like in terms of traceless, for instance, how many tons of product can they produce over the long-term target that we set?
How standardized is this approach across your portfolio? Because you're investing in different sectors that you've decided to focus on. Is it very standardized, or are there similarities, or is each sector different?
No, it's always the same approach. It's always a consequential life cycle assessment. And to my knowledge, and please prove me wrong, it's the only scientific way to calculate something like avoided emissions. There's no other way to come up with that. And if you look at the standard setting authorities like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, they also highlight that fact. It's a highly standardized approach. It's there's even an ISO norm for it that so we are following that ISO norm. And the approach is always the same. We use the data from the companies. We use publicly available data if need be. But there is a pocket of investments that are a bit different. We call them enabling technologies. And the European Commission in their Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation also has that kind of extra pocket. And those for us are software innovation technologies that are impossible to quantify because, for instance, they allow you to bring in climate intelligence into real estate asset management. Super important, super systemic effect, because without that knowledge about the physical and the transitory risks of climate change, you will make stupid decisions in the real estate sector. But it's impossible to link a specific ton of greenhouse gas emission savings to that tool. So for these small pocket of investments, we don't apply an LCA, but we do a scientific kind of rigorous scientific analysis.
And some of the products and services that you're investing in are new, very nuanced and in undeveloped industries. How do you predict their end of life to calculate the full life cycle assessment?
We try to look 10 years into the future, not even like 25 is look into the crystal ball. That's impossible. But 10 years is also challenging, given that they are so nascent, these markets, and the tech is very innovative. We take a lot of scenarios, for instance, with the International Energy Agency. How will the energy market evolve? What are the scenarios? And we sometimes even do Monte Carlo simulations. So calculating tens of thousands of different background scenarios to come up with a range of possible outcomes and then commit to, okay, why do we think this medium outcome or would be the most probable one? We try to be very transparent about all the assumptions that we do, and also are very aware that, for instance, the greener the electricity grid will be, then the climate advantage is decreasing because other solutions will become greener too. And so we are very aware of these side effects.
The research that you do is publicly available for use by other organizations. Do you have any examples where the work your team has done has had a positive impact outside of Planet A?
So we don't want to only create impact by the investments that we're doing, but also be a very collaborative player in the wider ecosystem and really inspire others. And obviously that's hard to measure, but I've seen over the last 4 years that more and more climate tech funds, but also generalist funds, are hiring scientists. And I find that super promising. And everybody seems to understand that in order to invest meaningfully into climate tech, you need to have a thorough understanding of the science behind it. And then obviously we get a lot of positive feedback on some of the thought leadership pieces on biodiversity, on measuring impact. But we're also a learning institution. It's not that we know it all. It's something that we are learning every single day, and we try to push boundaries. And I think there's still a long way to go.
In your 2024 impact report, you're discussing your life cycle assessment approach. And there was a comment that said that you realized that your method was not well tailored to address biodiversity. And then it went on to say something like that you've leveraged the best available frameworks, combined them with life cycle assessment methods, and then integrated additional models and data sets and developed a method that allows you to assess the impact of investment opportunities on biodiversity. So it's like you came up with your own proprietary biodiversity life cycle assessment. This comment that you wrote gets at the challenges around measuring the impact on nature, which has always been kind of nuanced and difficult. Can you talk to me through how this biodiversity life cycle analysis framework that you developed differs from your standard life cycle analysis framework?
I mean, one thing is clear, that we will not be able to solve the climate crisis without addressing the biodiversity crisis. It's so closely linked. And what we are seeing is what scientists call the sixth mass extinction. And we are losing not only species, but also habitats in an alarming rate. I just read the other day that wild animals only make up 4% of all biomass of mammals on Earth, and the rest is humans and livestock and the like. Understanding the impact of investments on nature and biodiversity is absolutely key. We have to be able to know. And we felt that there was not a single framework that was applicable for an early stage venture fund investor to really understand that and answer that question. So what we did is we developed our own framework that hopefully is applicable for other investors as well, and we published it. And what we did is we used an existing framework developed by a larger asset manager called the Biodiversity Footprint for Financial Institutions, which was developed at Finance at Biodiversity Initiative at the European Commission. And we combined them with our life cycle assessment approach and integrated some models and data sets, and now feel that we have a method that allows us to understand the impact of main drivers on biodiversity, land use change, climate change, pollution. And the indicator there is PDF. It's the potentially disappeared fraction of species in a surface area of 1 square meter over a duration of 1 year. So this is what you can assess. It's just a start. It does not allow you to cover ecosystem or genetic diversity. It does not allow you to understand the impact of alien species, but it is a very first important step, we find. And please, everybody, look at our website and take it.
You've described the science impact measurement and the life cycle analysis. How do those fit into the other investment KPIs that you look at?
You obviously have the usual KPI. You want to understand the revenue side. You want to understand the production side, how many customers, traction, etc. So we get this data. We also get ESG data because our LPs want to know. But then we obviously get annual updates on the impact KPI. And we set 1 to 4 impact KPIs depending on the mission of the startup. So if your mission is clearly on climate mitigation, we would set one indicator concerning saving or removing greenhouse gas emissions. But if your mission is very much on the biodiversity side, we would also put an additional indicator there. We also have examples where we set indicators for energy savings or for reducing the water consumption, land consumption. So they can vary depending on your mission.
Could you give me an example of an investment that Planet A has made and describe the end-to-end process from first identifying them and then assessing their suitability?
Because it's easiest and listeners might be comfortable with traceless already, I was just stick with that example and say from the outset, there was a clear understanding that this could be an interesting opportunity because the market is rapidly increasing for novel advanced packaging solutions. and there were two very strong female founders. And the beauty in it from the investment perspective was that it was very competitive in quality and price because they used leftovers from agriculture. And that is very different to many other competitors in the market. So during the screening and deep dive phase, the investment team became more and more convinced that that was a brilliant opportunity to team up with. While at the same time, at the science team, we understood all these advantages that I listed before in terms of land use, in terms of energy requirements, in terms of greenhouse gas emission savings. So in the end, we were fully aligned that from both perspectives, this was an amazing investment. And I'm happy to say that they raised 39 million euros in a new round just recently.
On your website, you wrote, "We are not only trying to prove impact, but like financial performance, are interested in improving it over time with your portfolio companies." What does that mean in practice? And how is that baked into your evaluation phase?
So for us, the LCA is not only a snapshot in time, but it's really the promise to the founders that they will always have access to up-to-date impact data. Whenever a founder will change their processes, products, they will come back to us and we will revisit the LCA and update it. And what it allows the founders to do is really understand, okay, which levers do I need to pull in order to improve impact? And it's always amazing to see how important this data is for the founders. I really have a lot of founders that look into every single aspect of the LCA saying, listen, but why is the water consumption still that high? What can I do about it? What can I do to improve there? And because it also always translates into reducing costs, obviously. And for them, the LCA is a way to understand where to go going forward, what to do, and how to change something in order to maximize impact.
Your website also highlights that you tie carried interest to an investment achieving its impact objectives and key impact-based KPIs. Can you give me an example of what that means in practice?
That means that we will be held accountable for achieving certain impact objectives that we set at the point of investment, and we define them over a 5 years time frame, considering the average holding period of an investment, and will need to reach a certain multiple in order to get 50% of our carried interest. And so our LP base will look at how well we do, and if we only achieve, let's say, 20% of these impact objectives over the lifetime of the fund, we will only get that fraction of the carried interest.
Are your investors exposed to any risks that are unique to your investment strategy? And if so, how do you manage these risks?
We came up with Planet A with a bold thesis that by being able to identify those most impactful solutions, we will return these amazing top-tier market financial returns. And for me, the biggest risk is in not being successful. And not only looking at Planet A, but looking at all these very young climate tech funds, because we have hardly any proof points for our thesis, right? You can point to Northvolt in Sweden, you can point to someone like H2 Green Steel, but it's very few examples where you can really say, look, they managed to scale hugely successful businesses. I mean, there are more climate tech unicorns now, so companies valued with $1 billion and more, but we are still early in the journey. So for me, the biggest mission is now to be hugely successful.
These are big ticket investments, and they need to be big ticket given the cost of the project. And some of these projects you've invested in, and I'm thinking like sustainable aviation fuel and carbon dioxide removals, are incredibly expensive. And I don't know, maybe a sustainable aviation fuel plant could cost up to £1 billion before it produces fuel. And of course, it carries a lot of risk because the technology still isn't really proven at scale. So on the surface, it doesn't seem to be an investable proposition for a venture capital firm without a extremely supportable policy. Is this accurate? And are you confident that regulation is currently or will be supportive enough and in place fast enough so that you'll have the runway to get these type of large projects off the ground within the timeline that's required in order to get the investment to pay off?
We would never invest into something that is dependent on subsidies, but obviously we need a very reliable policy environment to invest. And the Green Deal of the European Union delivers just that. We have a very clear path towards net zero in 2040. We have a 2030 target. We will now establish a 2040 target. And the returning president made it very clear that the Green Deal is here to stay. So the policy ambition in Brussels will remain. We will see strives towards a capital and savings union. We will see a competitiveness fund, and we will see how that is not only nurtured by the will to decarbonize, but also by the will to pull off a new industrial revolution in Europe and ensure independence from geopolitical tensions and also competitiveness in terms of jobs and skills and innovation in Europe. So I'm very comfortable that the path is quite clear. And some say in Europe we are so good with sticks, but we are so bad with carrots. That might be. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is a huge carrot, and we see the effects. But I think what we have in Europe is very predictable environment. So when we talk about aviation fuels, we have certain quotas, and the industry knows that they have to have a certain percentage of their fuel consumption being sustainable in the future. And that really shapes markets. And the same holds true for green methanol in the shipping industry. I mean, Maersk knows exactly that they need to decarbonize, and they now have ordered, I think, over 30 ships that run on green methanol, knowing that there's no green methanol available at all in these quantities, but betting on a future where innovative founders come up with that innovation to fulfill the demand.
And you're comfortable that you can count on that commitment in the EU going out 20 years.
What is promising to me is that it's not only a green thing, but it's really a cross-party conviction that we need to move ahead in order to be globally competitive, and that there is a strong industrial push behind it. So I'm quite comfortable with that. I think the challenge, in fact, is that policymakers are very far away from innovators. And when I talk to the members of parliament in Brussels, someone actually told me, look, I always have the incumbents in my office. I always have the steelmaker on my chair saying, please don't raise the CO2 price, otherwise I will go bust. I never have the young founder here in my office saying, look, I want to produce green steel, please raise the CO2 price. That's part of the political game, is always that the voice of the incumbents is always louder than the voice of the innovators. And to bridge that gap and to make these voices heard is something that I feel quite passionate about.
If you had to name the one most important challenge in the sustainable impact VC investing space at this time, what would it be? That
there is no standardized approach in how we understand and assess impact. And we see that with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. It's super confusing. There's different interpretation what's sustainable. And I'm very happy that the EU is now undergoing a reform of that and thinking around a specific category on impact investing, because we have to build trust, and we only will build trust if impact is comparable and reliable among LPs.
What do you know now about sustainable impact VC investing that you wish you knew in 2020 when you co-founded Planet A?
I did not foresee that our societies would become so polarized on climate change. We turned from there is no problem, the summers have always been warm, to we are doomed in no time. And I miss the middle ground. I miss the part where we say, look, what can we do about it? And many people, I feel, are being afraid of losing their right to heating with oil, their right to drive with a combustion engine, and their lifestyle. And we lack a positive vision of how that world could look like without all these things that we're used to, but still could be a beautiful world, maybe an even better world.
You don't have to name names, but can you describe to me an investment that you made that you were convinced of at the time you invested, that it ticked all your sustainability and impact boxes, but in the end, it didn't turn out? And what were the lessons learned from that experience?
There are no write-offs. There's no investment that we did that I would say, we shouldn't have. But maybe interesting, there are two examples where we initially thought, that's a great impact case. And the LCA taught us it's not. And the one would be leather substitutes, because all the values in the meat. So as long as we eat livestock, there will be enough hides to do leather. And so coming up with synthetic or bio-based leather substitutes will not affect the environment at all. And the second case was that I remember is lab-grown meat, so cultured meat in the poultry space. It's very different for beef and pork, but with poultry, it was very counterintuitive to find that there was no real significant positive impact.
Can you describe an investment that you had some level of skepticism, either at the time you invested or maybe you ultimately passed on it and did not invest, and in the end, it actually turned out way better than you thought and you were pleased you invested? Or if you had passed on it, you wish you had not passed on it, and what did you learn from that experience?
Missing out on opportunities is a painful part of our life. But there's surely a handful of cases where we would have loved to invest, but a generalist top-tier investor just took the whole deal, or we were unable to solve certain cap table issues. And we learned to turn that into growth for ourselves. So we learned to come up with strong reverse pitches, to do first intros even during the pre-investment phase, to build our platform approach. But the companies are still so young, so it's highly uncertain how successful they will be. And even deals that we did not do, you sometimes feel, it's still even not sure that they will make it. Look at Renewcell. It's a recycling fabrics company that raised 31 million euros last year and then filed bankruptcy earlier last year. Who knows what will be the big successes and which won't.
If someone wants to get into the sustainable impact VC investing space, where would you advise them to start?
I would say read up a lot. So read the classic Durr, Speed and Scale, or Hannah Ritchie, Not the End of the World. Engage in communities like Impact VC, Mosaic, Climate Voyager. So surround yourself with that ecosystem. Try to understand what the themes are, what the opportunities are. You might even want to consider gaining some experience in a startup. So really gather operational experience, because that's super valuable, and you bring that to the table when you come to VC. And also when we talk about climate tech, green tech, I think some background in nature sciences, be it, background in chemistry, in biology, in tech at large, is also very helpful entering the space.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the time you've taken to take me through all this. I've learned a lot. Now tell everyone your websites and your social media and all that good stuff where they can find out about what you're doing.
So the website is planet-a.com. And we also have a LinkedIn presence and we try to share a lot of deep dives, be it on the nature space, be it on industrial heat or critical raw materials. So please look out for our posts on LinkedIn, and also our presence on Medium.
That's Planet with a -A, is that right?
Yeah.
And what is it? Planet-a.com. Is that it?
That's it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And the best way for people to contact you?
Via LinkedIn, or my email is lena@planet-a.com.
Okay, Lena. Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having the opportunity. I enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact. all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.